Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Holochek, philosopher, historian, Thomas Jefferson scholar. And today I'd like to look at a rather outlandish claim that Thomas Jefferson had sex with Sally Hemings' brother, older brother, slave Bob Hemings. Now, Bob was the first of Elizabeth Betty Hemings' children. Other children were James, Benia, Creta, Peter, and of course Sally Hemings. And Elizabeth was owned by John Wales, who was a British sea captain and the father-in-law of Thomas Jefferson. And upon marrying Martha Wales Skeleton, Thomas Jefferson inherited the children of Elizabeth Betty Hemings. Now, these children were said to be fathered by John Wales. John Wales had 10 children, and it's Madison Hemings who tells us in his late 19th century testimony that all of these children were fathered by John Wales, who had a relationship with Betty Hemings. Now, we don't know whether that's true. Much depends on the veridicality of that testimony. And in my History News Network article in 2015, I give you a sufficient reason to call into question that testimony. Not to say that it's flawed in all respects, but it's flawed in several respects, and so it's hard to take seriously anything in the testimony. Now, as I said, we do know that Betty's children occupied significant positions in at Jefferson's Monticello. John became a highly accomplished joiner, and he did some of the most important carpentry at Monticello and especially at Poplar Forest. James traveled with Thomas Jefferson to France in 1784, and he learned French culinary. That's a skill that he took back with him to Monticello. Sally traveled with Thomas Jefferson's daughter Martha to France later on, and she stayed in France, presumably at the convent with Maria and older daughter Martha. And when back, she had light duties at Monticello. Now, Robert, who was born in 1762 and died in 1819, was called Bob by Jefferson, had pride of place in many cases. First, because he was the oldest of the children, and second, he was Jefferson's personal servant. He was Jefferson's right-hand man while he was just a boy. Bob went everywhere with Jefferson, almost everywhere, and that is until Jefferson journeyed to France in 1784 as minister plenipotentiary. And that, for all intents and purposes, ended the close relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Bob Hemings. Now, when Jefferson returned from France in 1789, he wanted Bob back as his personal servant. Sometime before 1791, Bob, however, fell and he met in love with a woman named Dolly. Now, Dolly lived in Fredericksburg. Bob refused to live apart from her, and Jefferson reluctantly freed him in 1794 so he can be with Dolly. Bob's services were indispensable to Thomas Jefferson, and that's indicated by a letter to Daniel L. Hilton on February 5 of 1792. Thomas Jefferson writes, Jefferson's looking for someone to replace Bob, and Jefferson writes, I give you the relevant section, having occasion for a servant boy who can shave, dress, and follow me on horseback, and none such being to be had here, I have thought of a small French boy, Joseph, who came from Europe with Mr. Skipwith, lived some time with Mr. Randolph, my son-in-law, and is now with a barber in Richmond. I will thank you to engage him to come to me immediately. The wages of such a boy are $4 or $5 a month generally. I would propose to give him 5, 6, or even 7, but not further, nor indeed so far if you can get him more reasonably. He will be fed and lodged and have a livery, and it will be expected he should be aided to do everything in the house. I will, moreover, pay his passage in the stage, to which, if you find it necessary, you may add a moderate and fixed stipulation for his subsistence on the road. I wish him to come on immediately, and will ask information from you as soon as you find whether he will come or not. Wow, this passage is suggestive and sexually suggestive, I think, in a number of ways. First, Jefferson has in mind a small French boy, suggestive that Bob had grown too old for Jefferson. Jefferson wants him to come at once, engage him to come to me immediately. That's used in the imperative. And he says, I wish him to come on immediately, the desiderative mode. Suggestive and doubly so because of the iteration of unsated, swollen sexual passions. The normal wages are $4 or $5 per month, but Jefferson is willing to pay up to $7 a month. He is to do everything in the house, suggested that Jefferson might have some special personal task to which the young boy will have to attend. Again, so great is Jefferson's longing that he is even willing to pay the young boy's passage to Monticello. Finally and last, there's the bit concerning whether the boy will come or not. With come, the word come here used 3 times. And the word come took on sexual significance as early as 1650. The language is suspicious. Jefferson is speaking of intense sexual longing. He's speaking of orgasm. Everything points to strong homosexual needs, which can only be sated by a young boy. And of course, wanting a French boy here, color is irrelevant, whether it's a young black boy or a young white boy or otherwise. Does everything I said so far seem outlandish, incredible, bizarre? Perhaps not. Recall that Jefferson's favorite authors, as reported by one of his granddaughters, were Greek and Roman authors. Homosexuality was rampant in both cultures. A man of high standing in Plato's Athens was expected to take a boy roughly between the ages of 12 and 20, when he was glabrous, hairless, under his wings, as it were, both for social guidance and sexual purposes. Now, Plato in his Phaedrus takes great pains to show the lengths to which a man would sometimes go, bankruptcy, and even social derision, to win the love of a young boy. Now, we only note that Bob's special status as Jefferson's service ended in 1784. That was when Bob was 22 years of age. Now, Bob would have been a man at this point. Perhaps Jefferson didn't have need of him anymore. If Jefferson so admired the Greeks and Romans, would it have been that astonishing if he should have adopted Greek and Roman social practices? I doubt it. And so Jefferson very likely had a hankering for adolescent boys. QED. So much for the shock value of the Sally Hemings story. It seems mild, pale in comparison. Now, the letter to Hilton is sexually suggestive as one is intent on sexually interpreting it. It can also be interpreted, however, non-sexually. Jefferson, from his time with his first servant, Jupiter, who, like Jefferson, was born in 1743, had come to rely on a servant for everyday matters. Now, why an adolescent, do you think? Well, the services of an adult slave, fitted more for robust activities, would, of course, be wasted. Now, there's a moral behind this outlandish, incredible, bizarre thesis and specs of persiflage, not serious history. It has become not only acceptable, but also praiseworthy to entertain and publish the most incredible theses concerning Thomas Jefferson's life. Consider Fawn Brodie's thesis in Thomas Jefferson and Intimate History, a thesis that concerned Jefferson's lust for Sally Hemings, and Brodie goes on to say even lust for his own daughter Martha. It's a thesis based on a somewhat dilettantish grasp of the principles of psychoanalysis. I've devoted a chapter of that in my work, not Dutiful Correspondent, on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Then there is Conor Cruz O'Brien's thesis in The Long Affair. And O'Brien argues that Jefferson from 1787 to 1793 so came to worship liberty that it was to him worth just about the loss of any life. More recently, there's Henry Winseck's thesis in his work, Master of the Mountain. Winseck argues that Jefferson personally loved slavery in spite of what he wrote because it proved profitable to him in a pecuniary manner. He could make money off slavery. That thesis, too, is flawed. Then there is Andrew Burstein's thesis in Jefferson's Secrets. Jefferson's presumed affair with Hemings was due to medical advice from a book by the French doctor Tissot, to seek a sexual outlet with a no-string-attached young woman for sustained health. Masturbation wasn't an option, said Stowe, because it was not healthy. Then there is Pauline Myers' absurd claim in her book on the Declaration, American Scripture, that Jefferson is the most overrated person in American history. An outlandish and absurd claim because she could not have done an exhaustive study of every single character in American history. Then there's Gordon Reed's, and that Gordon Reed's imaginative account in the Hemings of Monticello, in which she talks of what likely happened between Jefferson and Sally Hemings while the two were in France, though she grudgingly admits that Jefferson wrote nothing about it and said nothing about it to others. Finally, there is Maurizio Belsanio's The Limits of Optimism, which offers us a psychological assessment of Jefferson after he has pledged not to do so. And the book is filled with poorly articulated and poorly supported universal claims. Now, I could go on, and I can go on. There is the scholarship on Jefferson is sloppy, to say the least. Now, why is Jefferson scholarship so casual, sloppy, hyperbolic, indifferent to evidence, and wedded especially to cherry picking? The answer, I think, goes back at least as far back to Merrill Peterson's brilliant watershed book, The Jefferson Image in American Mind. Says Peterson, the Jefferson image may be defined as the composite representation of the historic personage and of the ideas and ideals, policies and sentiments habitually identified with him. Now, Peterson is not so much concerned with the truth or falsity of that image, of the Jefferson image, of the historical Jefferson. He's concerned with a depiction of that image and some assessment of what it tells us about our evolving culture. Because Jefferson seemed to be a baffling series of contradictions, philosopher and politician, aristocrat and democrat, cosmopolitan and American, later generations of historians comprehended his thought only in fragments crossing and colliding with each other until it seemed that the protean figure, if ever he had genuine historical existence, must never be rediscovered. Notice that for Peterson, the notice is not inscrutability, but a mind bewildering in its range and complexity. It's Jefferson's range and complexity that makes him a difficult figure for historians, not, as Peter Onuf has often said, that it's an impossible task. That range in complexity decuples, those things decuple the difficulties of a historian's task when fronted with Jeffersonian biography. However, it does not make Jefferson impenetrable. Okay, that thesis, usually a corrupt variant, a variant of it, has been iterated and reiterated in numerous books and essays on Peterson, Joseph Ellis's The American Sphinx, and of course Peter Onuf's The Mind of Jefferson. Onuf, in what I take to be a serious misread of Peterson, goes so far as to say that Jefferson is so inaccessible that in approaching him, I quote, "We are doomed to cluelessness in our own world like Plato's cave, a domain of shadows and hand-me-down light." End of quote. A historian thus can do no other than construct a possible Jefferson, viz. a Jefferson that is human like the rest of us and not a synecdoche for America, someone who by himself stands for America. Onufian historiography, as I've said before, is liberalism taken to its extreme. That is open-mindedness as an end and not as a means for an end. That is truth. If we follow Onuf's advice, then just about anything goes when it comes to Jefferson. And my account of Jefferson's homosexual attraction to Bob Hemings is as good a bit of Jeffersonian scholarship as is anything else that does not sanctify Jefferson. It's a possible Jefferson. And in fact, what I've done is I've put evidence forth to show that Jefferson had lust for young boys. So why not? Why isn't this historically reasonable? And according to Onuf, it certainly has to be. Yet, as historians, we need to recognize that the stance of open acceptance of historical accounts of Jefferson, others, or events in history is not only doomed to fail, but cancerous. The incautious scholar then gets treated The incautious scholar then gets treated the same as the serious scholar. Historians need to engage with and critically assess the works of others. That's something that historians today don't do. We laud or criticize other people without critical evaluation. And historical scholarship cannot proceed and it cannot advance if historians don't read other works, don't comment critically on other works, point out the flaws, point out what other scholars have gotten right. It's something we just don't do, something that is not encouraged too much in history today. Only when we do that can we hope for a clearer account of significant and sometimes not so significant historical figures in the times in which they live. Now, the question we ought to be asking does not concern the sloppiness of much of the Jeffersonian scholarship, but it's this: why are sloppy scholars often the most handsomely rewarded? Thank you very much.